Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of the Analyst brought to you by Vajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, in the first topic, we'll try to understand that how the LPG crunch, which has been caused because of the geopolitical tensions which are prevailing in the West Asia, has not only significantly impacted the household consumption expenditure in our country, but various other sectors of economy as well. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to understand what constitutes National Security Act of 1980 and what is the demand of 6th schedule by the people of Ladakh. Then from your simplified section, we'll take up 5 news. We will not only try to simplify the news for you, but also provide you the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching prelims 2026. So, stay tuned. Where the article highlights the recent liquefied petroleum gas crunch or LPG crunch which is being faced by our country right now and the various pragmatic measures which has been taken by the government of India so far. The issue which forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger theme of energy security. So let's first start our discussion by simply understanding what do we mean by liquefied petroleum gas. Keep this in mind that it is a mixture of hydrocarbon gases such as for example propane, for which the chemical formula is C3H8, and butane, for which the chemical formula is C4H10. And then these hydrocarbon gases are actually taken and compressed, and thus it basically converts into a form of a liquefied gas and thus act as a fuel for cooking, heating and various kind of industrial purposes. Keep this in mind that this LPG is a colorless and odorless gas in its natural form. However, for our own convenience, we actually add ethyl mercaptan in your LPG gas. Why? So it is kind of an odorant. So let's say for example, you are cooking at your home and there is a kind of a LPG gas leakage which has taken place. So to actually for your convenience that you are able to identify that gas leakage, this odorant ethyl mercaptan is actually added into LPG. Then the question shall arise in your mind that how we actually able to extract or process this LPG gas. So you guys can recall from our previous lecture that how we are more than 87% import dependent when it comes to the crude oil need which we have as of the totality of the country. Correct. So let's say we actually kind of procure this crude oil and then we actually refine this crude oil in various industries where we extract from this crude oil this hydrocarbon gases such as for example propane and butane. Then we kind of compress it, liquefy it and then transport it through the use of pipelines, and that constitute your petroleum refining and extraction of LPG gases. However, we can also extract this LPG gas from some natural gases like for example methane, for which the chemical formula is CH4, and that can also be done in the various gas processing plants. Now another question. Let's say for example, when we are facing such LPG crunch, and you guys can recall that how there are a lot of various government incentives and subsidies as well which actually exist to promote the use of LPG. Then why we actually kind of deviated towards LPG consumption so much, and that too in the last decade. So to actually understand this backdrop, let's refer to a report which was published back in the year of 2014 called as Access Survey, according to which at that point of time more than 750 millions plus Indians were actually overtly reliant on solid cooking fuel. Solid cooking fuel, for example coal, cow dung, or for example various kinds of firewood. Thus, by the use of this solid cooking fuel, there was a large scale emission of carbon dioxide which was taking place at that point of time, as well as it actually significantly contributed to the various kind of air pollutants, for example particulate matter 2.5 or particulate matter 10. For example, a report which was actually published back in the year of 2020 itself stated that how even at that point of time there were 41% Indians in our country which actually relied on biomass for cooking, and thus by the result of it they were actually emitting 340 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. Thus, with such large scale emission of carbon dioxide and particulate matter, it was significantly contributing to the increase of air pollution. Just refer to the World Air Quality Report of 2024 that how our country was actually ranked at having the third worst air quality in the world in among 134 countries. Or for example, how more than 3000 stations in our country had a PM 2.5 air quality which was categorized to be severe in the category. Now, don't you think such large scale use of solid cooking fuel was actually kind of contributing or proliferating into having detrimental impacts on various sectors of our economy? Like for example, it was actually leading to large scale air pollution, which is quite evident. And this air pollution was significantly contributing into various kind of cardiovascular diseases, thus kind of increasing the out of pocket expenditure for various families, kind of just pushing them into a kind of a poverty basket, vicious cycle of poverty. At the same point of time, don't you think these large scale carbon dioxide emission was also detrimental for our country to actually achieve the Paris Agreement target or the Panchamrit target which we have taken recently in the COP26? Thus, the LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, actually emerged as a kind of a viable alternative. Why? Because LPG has a high calorific value, which basically implies that it actually produces high energy or more energy and heat per unit of volume in comparison to the solid cooking fuel like coal, cow dung and firewood. At the same point of time, it is also considered as a much cleaner fuel because it emits less amount of carbon dioxide, smoke as well as soot in comparison to such solid cooking fuels. Also, from our previous lecture, you guys can recall that how we established that the sulfur emission or sulfur dioxide emission actually contributes to 1/3 of the PM 2.5 which exists. Thus, keep this in mind that if we are actually kind of now diverting or focusing upon LPG consumption, LPG actually kind of produces or emits 90 to 95% less SO2 in comparison to the solid cooking fuel. And thus, now you guys can very easily understand that why our government launched such kind of a flagship scheme called as Ujjwala Yojana back in the year of 2016, the major purpose of which was to actually kind of promote the people or promote the use of LPG among the larger masses, where the government was significantly targeting the below poverty line households, which were kind of recognized through the socio-economic caste census of 2011. The government said that we are basically going to provide 1600 rupees for every LPG connection, covering the security deposit, pressure regulator, as well as the installation charges. And then after that, for such BPL or below poverty line households, the government is going to provide a 300 rupees per LPG cylinder subsidy up to 12 refills or 1 refill per month for each year. The idea was that such subsidized LPG cylinders, where 1600 rupees is actually being provided to you by taking the LPG connection itself, and then the cylinder is actually provided to you at a very subsidized cost, thus making it affordable for the larger masses. The idea was that it will actually end up replacing the firewood, coal, cow dung cakes, and thus it will also significantly reduce the indoor air pollution as well. A survey which was actually conducted by the Indian Revenue and Economic Survey Services, it actually stated that how the share of Indian households which were using LPG as a primary fuel back in the year of 2011 was only 1/3 of the population, and how by the year of 2022, in a span of a decade, thanks to the government efforts and schemes like Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, it actually increased up to 84%. These are the latest achievements as per the month of February 2026, as mentioned in the Press Information Bureau, according to which the government has actually installed more than 17 crore plus LPG connections in the last 9 years. Additional 75 lakh LPG connections were actually planned for the mission mode implementation in the 2 years, that is 24 to 26. The government had also provided significant budgetary support in the budget of 2025, kind of providing 11,925 crore towards these LPG subsidy. So these significant steps which was taken by the government of India to actually kind of reduce down the air pollution, to actually reduce down the carbon dioxide emission, as well as to actually provide much more cleaner and cheaper energy alternative to the masses. It was a noble idea, but as we know that there always exist two sides of the coin, and thus the kind of the supply chain disruptions which has been caused because of the geopolitical war which is taking place between Iran and Israel, it had significantly led to the various kind of the decline in the import of the LPG gas, and thus these LPG cylinders are actually run into kind of a shortage. With their kind of the hoarding is taking place, black marketing is taking place, and thus it has actually become much more expensive now for the larger masses to actually rely on these LPG cylinders. The question arises that how we have reached to this situation. Let's first try to decode India's import dependency for liquefied petroleum gas. Keep this in mind that our country produces 40% of our LPG needs domestically itself. So basically, we import oil, let's say 87% of our total need, and then from that we refine and produce LPG domestically. That constitute 40% of our total need, which actually offers us a cushion and a scope to kind of diversify our supplies, thus kind of allowing our country to rely on internal production even if the shipments transiting the Strait of Hormuz actually faces disruptions amid the tensions in West Asia. But the question arises, for how long? Because keep this in mind that we are still reliant, 60% reliant for our total LPG consumption on imports itself, and 90% of this 60% import which we do actually transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because our largest LPG exporter is UAE, 24% of our total need, 11% comes from Qatar, 8% comes from Kuwait, 7.5% from Saudi Arabia, and from USA it is a meager share of 3.8% only. If we refer to the International Energy Agency, these imports actually increased threefold between the year of 2011 to 25. In 2015, our import dependency for LPG was only 47% of our total need. However, we have already established that how from the year of 2014 to 15 onwards, our government significantly started putting impetus on LPG consumption. Thus, while government was providing subsidies to actually kind of incentivize the people to increase the consumption of LPG, at the same point of time, we did not took care or put much more focus on indigenous production. Thus, we remained import reliant. The import reliance, which was 47% in 2015, has now increased to 60%. Keep this in mind that we consume more than 3 million tons of LPG per month, which makes us second largest consumer of LPG in the world. First, obviously, in this case is China, where in our country right now there exist approximately 33 crore domestic LPG connections as per the Hindu report. So we are basically 60% import reliant for LPG. 90% of that is actually being sourced from the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is actually trying to create blockade in this very strategic Strait of Hormuz, thus try to create a kind of an indirect pressure on USA and its allies. Don't you think that the various shipments and the containers which was containing these LPG and moving towards India has now actually kind of caught themselves in a stalemate kind of a situation? Thus, the import which we are doing is actually going to decline. And don't you think that will directly have the impact on the prices? So for example, even under the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, one cylinder of 14.2 kg actually cost around 613 rupees. If we look at those people who do not get these subsidized cylinders, the prices for them goes up to 913 rupees. Some of you might be thinking that yes, indeed, this is such a meager and small cost. Why such a issue? The point is that if we connect that with the economic survey of 2026, it states that how 5.3% of the population of our country actually falls in the category of extreme poverty, where their daily earning is actually less than $3 a day. In current foreign exchange, kind of the valuations which takes place, it will be less than 270 rupees a day. So it's very obvious that these people, they cannot afford these hefty cylinder prices which has been caused thanks to this geopolitical tension. Another question which will arise in your mind, that you are saying first and foremost that how we are import dependent for 87% of our crude oil need. The LPG import dependence is less than that, 60%. Then why the cost of crude oil is not significantly increasing? Because in that case, we do have strategic reserves which we have created at various places, like for example, Vishakhapatnam or Mysore or Chandikhol, etc., where we do have a good amount of petroleum strategic reserves which can actually sustain us for 9 to 10 days even if we do not import a single oil tanker. But the same pragmatic step was not taken by the government of India when it comes to the storage of LPG, kind of storage infrastructure of LPG in our country. So the first issue is the abysmal storage and production infrastructure which exists in our country. For example, as per the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas itself, the total amount of LPG which we have and the kind of the import which is coming, it is going to sustain us only for a period of 22 days. So let's try to understand that. In our country, these LPG, they are actually stored in underground caverns, as you guys can see in the picture as well. As per the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, we have two underground caverns in our country. One is at Vishakhapatnam and one is at Mangaluru. Keep this in mind that the total storage capacity of Vishakhapatnam and Mangaluru, these two underground caverns combined, is only 1.4 lakh tons, right? For example, some of you will be like that, sir, look at Mangaluru. It is our country's largest underground LPG storage cavern. It itself has a containing capacity of 8,000 metric ton. Yes, indeed. But our 1 day consumption of LPG which takes place in our country itself is 80,000 metric ton. That is equivalent to the entire storage capacity of the Mangaluru's cavern. Thus, we actually have less than 2 days storage capacity as of now in our entire country. Keep this in mind that 85% of this 80,000 metric ton is actually consumed by the households. So don't you think that we are, kind of quite behind when it actually comes to the underground storage infrastructure of LPG in our country? So that is the one major issue. Even the Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, when he was presenting himself in the parliament, in the case of the demand for grants in 2025, he stated very proudly at that point of time that how the government has no plans for constructing additional caverns beside these two at Vishakhapatnam and Mangaluru. The third is another follow-up question which you guys can ask, that sir, then why we are not exponentially increasing our storage infrastructure in our country? So if we look at the map of our country, right, there are three important geological zones which can be identified, which actually act as a kind of a naturally sustainable sites to create these underground caverns for LPG. Majority of them actually lies in this peninsular shield. This peninsular shield, which actually contains a thick layer of these granitic gneiss as well as Precambrian gneiss. So that actually provides a kind of a thick coating to actually procure this LPG in underground storage infrastructure. One is at Vishakhapatnam. A storage cavern lies 160 to 196 meter below. So that is already utilized. Second is Mangaluru, where the host rock is granitic gneiss with the floor at 141 meter below, mean the sea level. So that is already being utilized right now. The third actually lies in the Deccan Traps, kind of an exponential area with more than 5 lakh kilometer square. But here, when the survey was actually being done to create such underground caverns, the Engineers India Limited actually realized that the West Coast has encountered various difficulties because the kind of the rocks which exist here, right, they are actually not that solid enough to sustain the pressure from the above and to actually contain the gases in its desired format. So there is a kind of a shortage which we are facing in the region of Deccan Trap. That is one issue. The third is to actually realize now the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, which you guys can see here. The basin which is shared by three countries, that is Oman, Iran and UAE. This narrow strait here, right, around which you guys can actually see the major pipelines, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, the east to west crude oil pipeline, right, even the natural gas pipeline which exists here. So it is kind of located at a very strategic place. Keep this in mind that the Strait of Hormuz itself is responsible for 40% of our total crude oil import which we do, as well as 60% of the imports from Gulf countries, and 90% of that is actually crossing through this Strait of Hormuz. So it is very obvious that this trade blockade which is now being applied by Iran to kind of pressurize Israel and USA, it is going to have a detrimental impact on our country's interest as well. Now some of you may will argue that yes sir, ठीक है, कोई बात नहीं, the Strait of Hormuz is compromised, but in the month of February 2026 we had signed a deal with USA, where USA actually promised us that it is going to export 2.2 million tons of LPG every single year. So why we basically not kind of proliferate or kind of diversify our import basket and start importing from USA extensively? There is a major reason for it. First is that the cost of LPG which is actually being imported from USA is actually much more costlier when it compares to the kind of the LPG which we procures from this Gulf region. Third is that a container ship to actually arrive from USA, it actually takes more than 45 days. So we cannot be strategically reliant on USA in this regard. There is a logic of logistics as well. Also the incremental cost of logistic which is being kind of going to be added in the overall cost of LPG. Then there exists the issue of economic margins. Now let's try to understand that. So when we are saying, we have already established that we basically extract hydrocarbon gases like for example propane and butane from what? From crude oil. First thing. So now when we are extracting that, keep this in mind that let's say if we are going to take 1 liter of crude oil, the kind of the extraction of LPG only amounts to 4 to 5% of it. So there exists a very low yield of LPG per 1 liter of crude oil. Thus, if any one of you is suggesting that why we are not exponentially increasing our domestic production, don't you think to actually increase the LPG production, we will also be required to procure more crude oil, to actually pay more forex reserves for that, to actually incur negative balance of payment. First thing. Second, if we talk about the Indian refineries, they are actually optimized to produce high value fuels, diesel, petrol, etc. In fact, if these Indian refineries, if they extract propane and butane and they actually sell it to petrochemical industries, that would be much more profitable than kind of compressing it, converting it into LPG, then supplying through pipeline. So when they are actually indulging in LPG production, they are actually incurring a very thin margin of profit. Then very recently, there was a report by the Indian Council of Applied and Economic Research. It said that how even today there is a over reliance on traditional cooking method. only 5% of the households have electric penetration or induction, whose sale has significantly increased now. Then it's very obvious that how even it was happened during the time period of COVID. The same thing is happening now, where people are actually indulging into the case of panic buying, where they are not sure about the consistent supply of LPG cylinders, and thus either they are indulging into the practice of hoarding. A lot of traders, intermediaries have actually indulged in the practice of black marketing. That has further created a kind of an artificial lack of supply, right? Artificial shortage has been created by the various channels of the market. So that is another cause of the import dependency at current point of time. And what impact it is actually going to have on our economic growth? So just look at this article first. Let's try to understand this. How recently the Andhra Pradesh hoteliers were actually kind of advised by their finance minister to consider adopting rotational operations in the view of the ongoing cooking gas scarcity. And they actually proposed a kind of a system of alternate day operations, even to trim their menus and cut the operating hours. So don't you think that such hotel is now actually going to function at suboptimal level and thus kind of incur losses? Thus, let's say for example, I was going outside to eat in a hotel where they were actually using LPG cylinders, and now because of the cost of the LPG is going to significantly increase, the menu prices are going to increase as well. And that will act as a kind of a detrimental factor for me to actually not pursue going out at all and eating in that hotel. Don't you think the marginal propensity to consume, specifically for the non-essential goods, are significantly going to decline? The moment such marginal propensity to consume declines, the demand for the products declines as well, and thus the incentive for the industries to actually produce more also faces a downturn, leading to a vicious cycle of job layoffs. Then some of you, very intelligent of you, are still focused upon actually increasing the domestic production by procuring more and more crude oil. Don't you think these will actually lead to the higher imports, or even the higher imports of LPG, which we are going to incur now in the case of shortage? That will further worsen the current account deficit, as well as it can actually proliferate into the balance of payment crisis. Why? Because we will now be making more higher payments in the foreign currency, which will actually lead to the outflow of foreign exchange which we have. The foreign exchange reserve is going to decline, leading to what? Further depreciation of currency. So our currency is depreciating, and thus to procure the same amount of LPG, we will actually be paying more now. And that can actually lead to the issue of imported inflation across various sectors, which is obviously not a good sign for Indian economy, and thus our government has taken some pragmatic steps so far. First and foremost is to actually promote alternative fuel, where for example our government has actually provided 48,000 kiloliter of additional kerosene which has been allocated to state. The Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas stated that how the various oil refineries shall direct all the propane and butane which they have produced or recovered from the crude oil for the LPG production. For this purpose, the government has also enacted the Essential Commodities Act of 1955, where the government can actually kind of bypass the Article 19 and Article 301, and thus the government has mandated all the oil refineries to maximize LPG production. Then for the prevention of the artificial scarcity which is being created, the government has said that the mandatory gap between the domestic booking, earlier it was 21 days, now it has been further increased to 25 days. Then the government is also trying to prevent the illegal diversion which is taking place to the commercial markets by bringing Delivery Authentication Code DAC to almost expanding it to 90% consumers. And in the region of Delhi, these are the chains of priority which has been created for the supply of LPG cylinders. Education institute, railways, hospitals and airports has been given the topmost priority. Then the government PSU institutions, departments and canteens. Then comes restaurants. Then comes your hotels. Then your various dairies, bakeries, sweet shops. Then comes your caterers, dry cleaning, sports facilities, etc. So keep this in mind, this very important issue which has a significant impact on our Indian economy as well, right? And try to solve this specific question where you guys can actually suggest some very innovative way forwards. Like for example, in European Union, there exists a 90% rule when it comes to LPG, where in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, the European Unions basically kind of suggested or gave a directive to all the public utilities to have at least 90% storage capacity when it comes to LPG for the further future uses. Or for example, there is a very innovative suggestion which was actually given in one of the reports of Observer Research Foundation, where they said that why India is not utilizing salt caverns which it has, which is actually present in the region of Bikaner and Barmer, where you can actually, keep your LPG, right, in underground salt caverns, which are actually much more cheaper to create also, in comparison to the caverns which we have in the region of, for example, Vishakhapatnam or Mangalore, for example. So these are some innovative suggestions. Try to attempt this particular question and we move forward to the next news, where the article provides a great insight into the issues which is being faced by the people of Ladakh that has actually led to protest and violence in the Union territory amidst the demand of the 6th schedule status for the Union territory of Ladakh, an issue which forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of government policies and its interventions. So first and foremost, let's first try to understand what constitutes this National Security Act under which this person, Sonam Wangchuk, was actually detained by the government of India. First and foremost, keep this in mind that it is a preventive detention law. So you guys can recall from your polity lecture that the Article 22 itself provides for the concept of preventive detention law, where Article 22 Clause 3 states that the safeguards which are actually provided to an arrested person is not applicable to a person who is either an alien enemy or is actually detained or arrested under the preventive detention laws such as, for example, National Security Act of 1980. Thus, this NSA 1980 actually allows the government to, detain the individual to protect what? The national security of the country, to actually maintain public order if it has been disrupted, or to also ensure and regulate essential supplies as well as services. So keep this in mind that Article 22 Clause 7 itself states that it actually leaves up to the Parliament to prescribe the overall detention period of such an individual who was, let's say, for example, anyway threatening the national security or who was disrupting the public order. Thus, in the case of NSA 1980, under section 13, a person may be detained for a maximum period of 12 months. What are other key provisions? So first and foremost, who can order such detention? Section 3 tells us that it can be either central government or it can be state government. The state governments also have the power to authorize or delegate this function of ordering such preventive detention to the district magistrate or to the commissioner of police. Section 8 says that such a detained person must be informed of the grounds of arrest within 5 to 10 days. And then under section 9, the government shall refer the case to an advisory board. The advisory board, which is basically chaired by either a sitting or retired judge of High Court. So the government shall transfer this case to such advisory board to examine the case within the period of 3 weeks of arrest. And then there are additional 7 weeks which are actually provided to these advisory board, which is now being chaired by the retired or the sitting judge of High Court to examine the case and actually determine the period of arrest. If, let's say for example, the advisory board says after a period of 7 weeks that no, we do not have found any prima facie case against the accused and thus the accused shall be released, then the government will release the accused, as in the case of Sonam Wangchuk. Thus, still they can arrest such a person under preventive detention law for a period of 10 weeks. Section 16 also provides a kind of an immunity to the officials who were involved. For example, it states that the officials acting under the Act are protected from legal proceedings if the actions are actually taken in a kind of a good faith. Many of the time, the students actually end up getting confused between NSA 1980 and Unlawful Activity Prevention Act of 1967. In this particular case, there is not an individual who is only threatening the national security or the public order. Rather, it is an action of an individual or association which actually intends to bring cession or secession of Indian territory, where it actually disclaims or questions entirely India's sovereignty and integrity, let's say for example on a particular reason, and thus kind of instigate the public to take anti-government actions and thus cause disruption of harmony or public order. Through the 2004 amendment, it also included for the first time the term terrorism itself in the provision of the act. And by 2013 amendment to the UAPA 1967, the concept of money laundering has been added as well. Why? Because in the year of 2010, India became a member of Financial Action Task Force. Now, the question shall arise, what is Financial Action Task Force? So, it is basically a kind of an international organization which set certain international standards to combat what? To actually combat the issue of money laundering, which is taking place across the country, as well as illegal terrorist financing as well. Currently, Financial Action Task Force has 37 country members. Keep this in mind that this organization was actually created in the year of 1989 by G7 countries, USA, UK, France, Germany, etc. I have a small question for all of you. This Financial Action Task Force is headquartered at which place in the world? If any one of you can tell me. Now let's try to understand the provisions of UAPA. The section 43A to F, it actually gives the special power to the National Investigation Agency, which was actually established as a statutory body under the National Investigation Agency Act of 2008, which was actually kind of formulated in the backdrop of the 26/11 attacks which took place. Thus, NIA can actually take over the cases, remember, even without the state government's consent. And they also have the power to even kind of seize the property of the accused. Now, here there was a kind of a formation of an advisory board which had a time period of 7 weeks to actually kind of examine the case of the person who has been arrested. But in the case of UAPA, the NIA has the power to detain a person for 180 days without filing the charge sheet itself. In fact, in the case of UAPA, remember, bail is the rule, the bail is the exception and jail is considered to be the rule, thanks to the section 43D clause 5, where bail is denied even if there is a prima facie case which exists without proving it in the court itself. Court also have very limited power to grant the bail, and the penalty exists up to the level of capital punishment or life imprisonment. A tribunal here also is created under section 5, which is again headed by a high court judge, which reviews the ban of any such organization which has been labeled as terrorist organization within the period of 6 months. So these are the kind of the differences, stark differences which exist between NSA 1980 and UAPA 1967. Now, another question which shall come in your mind. What forms the backdrop of the protest and then the subsequent arrest of this person, Sonam Wangchuk, who was also famously portrayed in a movie called as Three Idiots as Funsuk Wangdu? So what actually led to the arrest of this person? To understand that, we will follow this table. The date is August 5 and 2019 and Ladakh has actually become a union territory. In the month of December, the very same year, the Ladakh Student Environmental Action Forum, a kind of a giant student initiative, it actually holds protest in Leh demanding for the 6th schedule. 6th schedule which actually provides certain specific safeguards to the tribal areas in our country, and currently it is implemented in the 4 northeastern states, which stands for ATM Square, that is Assam, Tripura, Mizoram and Meghalaya. The same was being demanded by the Ladakh Student Environmental Action Forum. Then two more organizations were created, which has become kind of very politically active in the region of Leh and Ladakh to actually kind of demand for the 6th schedule. One is Apex Body Leh, ABL, and the other is Kargil Democratic Alliance. Keep this in mind that when it was announced that there is going to be take place election in Ladakh, that was Ladakh Autonomous Hill Development Council poll, the BJP itself, when it was actually kind of contesting for the election, in its election manifesto, it ended up promising 6th schedule to the people, thus kind of indirectly recognizing the demands of the people of Leh Ladakh. Wangchuk actually started a kind of a 21-day fast in 2024 in sub-zero temperatures in Ladakh to actually create a pressure on the government at that point of a time on the behalf of apex body of Leh. Then the government actually created a high-powered committee as well to actually talk with ABL, to actually talk with KDL. However, this protest kept on continuing and came to a kind of a culmination date of September 24, 25, where protest, which actually began as a hunger strike by the environmentalist Sonam Wangchuk, it kind of led or spun out of the control, leading to the violence in which 4 people were killed. Now the questions shall arise that why the young, the youth of the Ladakh are actually protesting? Why they are in the need of such 6th schedule? First and foremost, try to understand that for any protest, there shall exist large scale unemployment, and that is the case of the Ladakh as well, where youths are actually frustrated with the lack of jobs. Giving interview, the leader of the apex body of Leh actually said to Hindu that how earlier the government had promised that in the staff selection committee, the government is going to release a notification of 12,000 jobs. However, since the creation of UT, only meager 700 jobs has actually been promised by the government or the notifications for which has been released. Thus, they actually want a kind of a decentralized democratic governance in the region of Ladakh, and that has led to the demand of statehood for Ladakh as well as the inclusion in the 6th schedule. They also demand for the establishment of a Ladakh Service Commission, which is going to specifically kind of release the notifications for the jobs, conduct a kind of a transparent examination, provide the result in a kind of a fast-paced manner, right? Also do not create such complex forms that the students actually take 10 days to fill the form itself. That's why they are demanding for Ladakh Service Commission and 2 parliamentary seats, one in Leh and one in Kargil. So to actually understand the socio-economic deprivation which is being faced by the youth of the Ladakh, and that's why they are actually kind of demanding for this autonomous district council, let's first try to understand the socio-economic composition of the Ladakh. Ladakh actually consists of the various tribal population, like for example Boto, Balti, Yochangpa, Brokpa, Drokpa, Purikpa, etc. If we look at the kind of the economic division of Ladakh, keep this in mind, 13% actually falls in the category of poorest or in the category of extreme poverty. 30% of them actually falls in the category of lower middle income, and 27% falls in the category of middle income quintile. Thus, almost 70% of the population of Ladakh actually falls in the category of low to lower middle income economy, and that is being shared by us by the National Family Health Survey 5. Thus, when actually there was a declaration that Ladakh is going to become a union territory, there was a high expectation from the people where they were expecting that how there is going to take place mass development and industrialization in the region of Ladakh. However, these promises has not actually materialized at the grassroots level. Just look at the number of the men and women who are actually still indulged in agriculture, forestry and fishing. Just look at the number of the people who are actually indulged in manufacturing. hardly 4.17% of women and 5% of men, that is less than 9 to 10% of the population of the entire Ladakh. Thus, large-scale industrialization and massive employment in various sectors of the economy actually remains a distant dream for the people of Ladakh. Or for example, just look at the gross enrollment ratio in the higher education by the people of Ladakh, that is a meager 11% and less than half of the kind of the average level which exists across our country. In fact, even if we talk about the elementary education, the ratio in Ladakh is abysmally low at 67% in comparison to 96% across our country. Thus, the people of Ladakh are not getting good education and are not getting employed, leading to the demand of what? The sixth schedule. The sixth schedule, which is actually provided under Article 244 Clause 2 and Article 275 Clause 1 of the Constitution, currently applicable in the 4 states of Northeast, Assam, Tripura, Meghalaya and Mizoram, which actually allows for the people of Ladakh to create autonomous district council and autonomous regional council. The question shall arise in your mind, what is the difference between both of them? So let's say, for example, there is a specific district. This entire district is actually inhabited by only one tribe, that is Balti tribe. So in this case, we will create autonomous district council. However, there is another district in Ladakh which consists of various tribes, Changpa, Brokpa, Purikpa, etc. Then we will create autonomous regional council. These ADCs and ARCs in the region of Ladakh actually contains executive, legislative and various kind of judicial powers, thus leading to the kind of democratic devolution of power, where they actually have, these councils have the power to make laws. Laws for what? For the management of forest resources, or for example, to actually regulate the agriculture, or to actually regulate the trade of the various commodities, or let's say for example to create a specific law for the purpose of town planning, where they can actually make such laws to preserve their own cultural practices, custom, traditions, languages, etc. As it has been done, for example, to preserve the language of Bodo and thus creation of a Bodo Autonomous District Council in the region of Assam. Then they also have the power to kind of create self-arbitration courts or village councils or courts to actually administer their own laws. And remember, for this purpose, they can actually appoint their own officers as well. So for example, let's say if there is a specific traditional law which they follow, they can actually implement it through such self-arbitration courts. But keep one thing in mind. Let's say for example, you are a part of autonomous district council where you have your own self-arbitration court, but you ended up committing a crime of heinous in nature. For example, you ended up committing the crime of stealing someone's heart. And in that case, under the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Samhita 2023, the punishment is either of 7 years of imprisonment or capital punishment. In that case, the assent of the governor is required. So don't you think that still there is a kind of a interference, that is the interpretation of these councils, by the central government? Then there is a grant in aid which is actually provided by the Finance Commission. It can be some local issues specific grants or tied grants for the development of basic essential services. Like for example, it can be for sanitation, or for example to actually provide drinking water, or for rainwater harvesting. Then they can actually impose and collect local taxes as well. And they are responsible for licensing and extracting of the minerals, thus kind of preserving the deforestation in the region, over extraction of the minerals. These councils, they actually consist of 26 members who are actually elected among the people and 4 members who are nominated by the governor, where these councils have a term on the paper that is 5 years. Remember, do they have a security of tenure? Absolutely not, because these councils functions on the whims and the fantasies of the governor, where the governor can actually dissolve these councils at any given point of time, citing the issues, let's say for example, the threat to national sovereignty, or for example for the disruption of public order, both the terms which are quite ambiguous in the nature and thus kind of leave a large scale discretionary power in the hand of the governor itself. That is another issue. What government has done? Government is not providing them sixth schedule. Government is saying that see there are certain issues which we can see in the regions of northeast states, and that's why we are not kind of devoluting this power of ADCs and ARCs to the very strategic region of Ladakh. The first and foremost is the most major issue, and that is that it actually ends up creating multiple power channel in the region. So for example, you can see that how there exist ADCs, then there exist ARCs, then there exist the officers which are appointed by these council, then there exists district magistrate in the region, the DSP in the region which is appointed directly by the central government, then there exists your governor also. So in the case, let's say for example in the future, Ladakh is a very strategic union territory for us because it shares boundary with our very dear and kind of very cordial neighbor, that is China. So let's say the government in the future is actually creating a kind of a vibrant village program in the region to actually kind of integrate that region with the nation in a kind of a much better manner. But these councils are not adhering to that idea. Don't you think it can actually become detrimental to our overall India's security itself? Second exists the issue of the various kind of financial devolution, where these councils they overtly reliant or are kind of overtly financial dependent on the grants in aids which is given by the various finance commissions. But even then in the implementation of those things there exists a kind of a corruption, large scale corruption which prevails in these councils, where the grant in aids are not implemented with the spirit of later. Thus the government is saying that okay, we are not going to give you sixth schedule, but we are going to fulfill your demands through other means. For example, Ladakh Civil Services Decentralization and Recruitment Regulation of 2025, which actually provided for domicile requirement for recruitment in the government job, where for example, if you have lived for 15 years in Ladakh and has studied there for 7 years, or you have appeared in class 10th and 12th examination from the region of Ladakh itself, or if you are a children of central government's employee who has actually served in the region of Ladakh for more than 10 years, then only you are going to be actually recruited in the civil services of Ladakh. Then reservation for job regulation 2025. 85% of the jobs in both the public and the private sector are actually reserved for SC, ST, OBC and educationally backward people. Earlier it was such reservation was only 50%. Then 10% additional reservation has been actually provided for the economically weaker section, for the reservation in jobs, engineering, medical colleges, etc. Then in the Autonomous Hill Development Council regulation of 2025, 1/3 seats has been actually reserved for the women of Leh and Kargil. Even when it comes to the official language, along with your English, Hindi and Urdu, two specific languages of Bhoti and Purgu has also been given the official language status. And the government has promised that it is going to provide further institutional support for promoting Sheen, Brokstad, Balti, Ladakhi. Coming to the issues which still persist, despite the various efforts which is being taken by the government, the negotiation which is taking place from the high-powered committee, the issues which is being raised by the apex body of Leh and the Kargil Democratic Alliances, that we are not getting any constitutional protection. Specifically, for example, under Article 240, where the President is directed to make regulation for union territories and the preservation of the various kind of tribes. The executive decisions amended or withdrawn by the center anytime, unlike 6th schedule which actually provides them a kind of a little bit of guarantee. No discretions on the land ownership by the non-domicile, so there is no restriction on them. So even a non-domicile, let's say for example the large conglomerates like for example Ambani and Adani can actually procure land in the region of let's say Ladakh and then kind of create actually high scale industrialization, but it will also significantly impact the local climate of Ladakh. No local council has any law making power. There does not exist any cultural protection roadmap for the use of local languages in administration. So these are still the issues which is being raised by ABL and KDL. Keep them as in your mind to actually write a good way forward here, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll try to understand that what is this specific term HALEU-Th, and for that, what is the issue which has actually been raised by a very important body, that is Bhabha Atomic Research Center, where a report which was published by Bark in the journal Current Science, it has actually turned radioactive because it has actually brought a kind of a huge furor among the scientist community in our country, where this report basically stated that one of the India's leading nuclear scientists actually characterizing its conclusions as misleading, where the study actually compared the relative merits of the different mixes of the uranium fit which we actually uses for nuclear power, and concluded that one of such mix, that is HALEU-thorium, was actually unsuitable for our current fleet of reactors. So to actually understand this, we'll try to actually go through the 3-stage nuclear program which exists in our country, and very important for your prelims examination. A lot of statements can be made there. First, let's try to understand two things. What is a fissile nuclear fuel and what is a fertile nuclear fuel? A fissile nuclear fuel is basically a kind of a fissile isotope which can be directly utilized as a fuel in any kind of nuclear reactor. However, a fertile nuclear fuel needs to be converted into the fissile fuel. So for example, uranium-233, 235 and plutonium-239 are fissile materials, right? You basically put them and they will go into the kind of a nuclear fission and will start producing energy for you. In sharp contrast to that, fertile nuclear fuels like for example uranium-238 and thorium-232, you basically need to first convert them into fissile materials and then they will go into the kind of a nuclear fission reaction. Keep this in mind that in our country, we do have ample amount of uranium reserves. Like for example, Jaduguda, Narva Pahad, Toramdi in the region of Jharkhand, your Tummalpalle and Lambapur in Andhra Pradesh, your Pedagattu in the region of Telangana, the belt which is shared between both Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the Rohil mine which exists in Rajasthan, or your Domia Siat which exists in Meghalaya. If UPSC gives you these locations and asks you what are they are basically very important uranium sites in our country which gives us uranium. We have understood the difference between fissile and fertile. Now let's try to understand the pressurized heavy water reactor. So that is the first stage of our nuclear program where we actually utilize natural uranium. What is natural uranium? So we basically use 0.7% or 7 kg of uranium-235. Look here, uranium-235 is a fissile nuclear fuel. And then we use 993 kg of uranium-238, which is basically a kind of a fertile nuclear fuel. So this fissile nuclear fuel will actually starts colliding with your fertile nuclear fuel, that is uranium-238, and the collision will actually leads to the kind of the release of various neutrons. The neutrons will further collide with uranium and thus will kind of create a fission reaction, nuclear fission reaction. Remember, in the pressurized heavy water reactor, we basically use deuterium or DTU, that is also termed as heavy water, as both as a moderator of the reaction as well as the coolant of the reaction. Currently, the majority of the nuclear power plants which exist in our country, 22 of them actually function under the pressurized heavy water reactors, right? So now this uranium-238, which is a fertile material, it absorbs a neutron and then it further transforms into what? A plutonium-239, that is considered as a spent fuel. And plutonium-239 naturally itself is a fissile material, and that's why we basically extract this spent fuel to actually used as the second stage, that is the fast breeder reactor. Uranium-238, plutonium-239. So we basically creates a kind of a blanket of uranium-238. Inside it, we basically create a chain reaction of the fissile material, that is plutonium-239. The moment it absorbs neutron, it starts converting into plutonium-239, and thus this second stage actually becomes a self-sustaining chain reaction. Here liquid sodium is actually used as a coolant. Third stage is advanced heavy water reactor, where we are actually trying to use thorium-232 to actually kind of produce, kind of convert this fertile material into uranium-233, which is a fissile material. So it will actually eventually undergo nuclear fission to create self-sustaining chain reaction. Here the coolant can be the light water also. Why we are actually putting so much of impetus on this third stage is because we do have enough amount of thorium reserves in our country. Thorium reserves, which are basically placer deposits, finds along your streams, rivers, beaches, etc., and majorly extracted from the monazite ore. What is monazite? Monazite is basically a rare earth phosphate mineral. It is naturally found in the various coastal districts like Tirunelveli, Thoothukudi, Kanyakumari, or along the coast of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Odisha and Andhra Pradesh. Is it found on entire coast of India? Absolutely not, right? That was the level of UPSC examiner when he was creating the question. Keep this in mind that in our country, Indian Rare Earth Limited, which is basically a body which functions under the Department of Atomic Energy, is the only authority to mine and produce monazite in our country. And these are your important operational nuclear power plants. If UPSC will ask you, Naroda, Uttar Pradesh, Kakrapar, Gujarat, Tarapur, Maharashtra, Kaiga in Karnataka, or for example, Kundankulam in the region of Tamil Nadu. Remember all of this. Now, what is the issue which has been highlighted in the today's article? So, currently in our pressurized heavy water reactors, which spans 22 reactors across the country, there are three kinds of mixtures of fuel which we use. First is the natural one. If you guys remember, 0.7% of the fissile 235 and rest 993 kg of fertile uranium 238. Then there is the enriched uranium, where we use basically 11 kg of uranium 235 and 989 kg of uranium 238. However, there is this mixture, HALEU-Th, HALEU-Thorium, where we actually use 235, 239 and a great number of thorium which is present in our country in a large way. Remember, this HALEU-Th actually yields the highest burn up of 50 gigawatt days per ton and generates the least amount of spent fuel. However, the recent report basically suggests otherwise. It says that how it actually renders the shutdown rod 26% less effective, and that is the major criticism. So even then there are two positives. There is a major criticism. So what is this shutdown rod? Shutdown rod is basically kind of utilized in any kind of nuclear power plant, that if we are unable to sustain this fissile chain reaction which is taking place and too much energy starts getting produced and we cannot contain it right into the energy converters, then we actually use such shutdown rods to entirely shut down the fissile chain reaction itself. The scientist who were basically writing in the Science Journal, he basically criticized this kind of a mixture of the uranium fuel which we were utilizing, that it actually renders the effectiveness of such shutdown rod by 26%. And thus, if you are actually overtly going to rely on the thorium or the third stage of the nuclear program, then significant change will be required in our country's design. Keep this in mind. And that was actually, so BARC team reported that the fuel could significantly reduce the effectiveness of the shutdown rod in existing pressurized heavy water reactors. And thus significant design is required, kind of the change is required to, if we actually want to achieve the target which we have set for ourselves in the budget 2026 to actually become 100 gigawatt of nuclear energy by the year of 2047. Thus, the critics have expressed concern that the new fuel might distract from our country's three-stage nuclear power program. Keep these debates in your mind and we move forward to the next news, where we'll quickly try to learn about the concept of the fertilizer subsidy which is applied in our country and how, even when it comes to fertilizer subsidy, we are actually facing a huge import dependency. So first and foremost, what does the article says? The article says that with the Kharif season which is going to begin from the month end, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Fertilizers, which is headed by the Trinamool Congress Member of Parliament, has warned of an acute shortage of an essential fertilizers. So citing the ongoing geopolitical tensions which is prevailing in the West Asia and the consequent pressure on the international shipping routes, the panel has underlined the need for a proactive and forward-looking strategy to actually kind of safeguard India's fertilizer supply chain. First and foremost, let's try to understand Kharif crop क्या होता है? Kharif crops are those crops which are actually sown in June, July, just with the onset of the monsoon, and harvested in the month of September and October. So we can, as we are living in our country, we know that in this time period between these months, there exists warm and humid climate, where the average temperature basically ranges between 25 to 35 degrees Celsius. Obviously, the farmers who are growing these Kharif crops, they are overtly dependent on monsoon. So basically, these Kharif crops, they require moderate to heavy rainfall of between 50 to 200 centimeter. And thus the crops which are grown are also water intensive crops, where to actually grow these crops, kind of waterlogged conditions are often required. And thus these Kharif crops, they thrive in the tropical monsoon climates and are grown in across the soil varieties which are available in our country. Black soil, red laterite soil, loamy soil, alluvial soil, which is actually found on the banks of the various river systems. Coming to the major Kharif crops and what is India's rank and the largest producing states. So very important table from the perspective of the prelims examination. For example, recently we have actually become the largest rice producing and exporting country in the world, and which state has the largest production? West Bengal. When it comes to bajra or pearl millet, we are actually again the top producing country. The state which produces the highest amount of pearl millet is Rajasthan. In the case of finger millet or ragi, it is Karnataka. In the case of cotton, Gujarat. In the case of jute, it is West Bengal. In the case of groundnuts, we are basically second in the terms of production, and the state with the highest production is Gujarat. Same goes with tea, and the state which actually produces the highest amount of tea is Assam, followed by West Bengal and Tamil Nadu. And ultimately to soya bean, we are ranked 5th, and the state which produces the highest amount of soya bean is 5th. Which are the kind of the Kharif crops which are actually covered in your MSP also, minimum support price also. So for example, your rice, jowar, bajra, maize, tur, arhar, moong and urad, groundnut, soya bean, sesame, sunflower, as well as cotton. So when it comes to the fertilizer subsidy, which is actually provided for the various kind of Kharifs and Rabi crops, keep this in mind that the government basically implements the nutrient based subsidy scheme, where government basically provides two kind of the subsidies which are actually given on the basis of nutrients. So government is saying that, okay, do you want to actually increase your crop productivity? You say yes. Government is saying we are going to provide you diammonium phosphate and muriate of potash. But for that, you are actually required, the people who are actually importing these fertilizers and the people who are manufacturing it also, they actually are required to maintain a healthy N is to P is to K ratio of 4 is to 2 is to 1. The more you deviate from this ratio, the lesser subsidy will be given by the government, and thus does government directly control the subsidy of these fertilizers to the farmer? No. The only fertilizer for which the government actually directly intervenes is urea, right? The only controlled fertilizer. But here, because the government is actually kind of indirectly subsidizing the importers, the manufacturers of the subsidy, thus the idea is to actually kind of get as closer to this healthy ratio as well, and this is called as informal control design. Urea, the only controlled fertilizer in our country for which the government actually decides a statutory price, which is the most produced, used and imported fertilizer. How the subsidy for urea is calculated? So the cost of production is actually divided by the cost of import minus actual price which is paid by the farmer, right? Remember, the government has also introduced 100% neem coated urea to actually kind of disincentivize the farmer to use a lot of fertilizer, and that is mandatory for all the domestic producers as well. Now let's have a quick look at the data which has been provided to us by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Fertilizers, according to which the domestic production of urea in this year financial cycle is estimated to be 306 lakh metric ton, versus we are still going to import 85 lakh metric ton of fertilizer. The government of India is saying that, okay, we have actually kind of incentivized the importers, or more importantly the manufacturers, and thus look at the import share of urea, which was 28.5% in 2021, but it has significantly declined to 15% in 2025. However, For this 85 lakh metric ton which we are going to procure, the government is going to incur a subsidized cost of 32,000 crore. And for the domestic manufacturers also, because urea is subsidized to the farmers, the government incurs a cost of 91,000 crore. Keep this in mind that for this diammonium phosphate, muriate of potash, we are actually import dependent for 90% of the rock phosphate, 100% for potash, and we have very limited availability of sulfur, which is obviously going to be further exacerbated because of the geopolitical disruptions, global commodity price volatility, and foreign exchange risks as well. So the government has also taken some steps where government is actually trying to incentivize the farmers to move towards organic farming, to actually use less amount of fertilizers and pesticides under your Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana. The government is also actually giving the farmers soil health card. So doing kind of soil analysis, providing them an exact card that this is the kind of the N is to P is to K ratio which you shall adhere to, which is good for your crop. So do not actually extensively utilize urea. Third, neem coated urea and nano urea, which actually kind of decline the overall uses of area by actually increasing the productivity itself. So keep these things in your mind, keep the datas in your mind, important statements can be made from that, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll have a quick look on the tiger statistics of our country. First and foremost, why it is in the news? Because of the 166 tiger death which was recorded across the country, 41 or 25% of them actually occurred in the state of Maharashtra. This data was actually given to us by the forest minister, right, from the National Tiger Conservation Authority, which released this data for the year of 2025, that how there was more than 166 tiger death which actually occurred, where he was actually responding to the question from the members regarding the recent tiger death which has been occurred in which important tiger reserve, Pench Tiger Reserve. It lies in which state? In the state of Maharashtra. So some important facts for tiger. For example, Bengal tiger is actually considered as the national animal of India, and it is listed as endangered on IUCN and on the Appendix 1 of CITES. So to actually preserve it, the Project Tiger was launched back in the year of 1973. And there is a kind of a highest degree of protection under Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which has been accorded to the tigers. The tigers, which in our country are actually found in diverse habitats, for example, tropical forest, grasslands, mangrove swamps, where actually the Bengal tiger is found. So just a small fact sheet for prelims, keep this in mind that in 1973 when the Project Tiger was launched, there existed 9 tiger reserves and the population was approximately 1827. However, in 2023 we have almost, in the 50 years, we have actually doubled the tiger population to 3600, and there exist now 55 tiger reserves. Our country is actually home to 75%, that is 3 by 4th of the tiger population in the world. And for the specific need of the preservation of the tigers across the country, National Tiger Conservation Authority was created under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. Thus, it is a statutory body and it is chaired by which particular personality, and that is the Minister of Environment. So, as per the All India Tiger Estimate, which was released back in the year of 2023, the number of tiger which existed in our country was 3,682. If UPSC gives you to rank them state-wise from highest to lowest, the Madhya Pradesh has the highest, followed by Karnataka, Uttarakhand, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. UPSC asks you which state has the lowest tiger numbers, where the tiger do not exist at all. Nagaland and Mizoram, followed by Jharkhand, Goa and Arunachal Pradesh. UPSC asks you another difficult question. Rank the tiger reserves with declining population. Highest is Jim Corbett in Uttarakhand, followed by Bandipur in Karnataka, then Nagarhole in Karnataka, then Bandhavgarh in Madhya Pradesh, Dudhwa National Park in Uttar Pradesh, Mudumalai in Tamil Nadu, Kaziranga in Assam, Kanha National Park in Madhya Pradesh and Sundarban in West Bengal. Which are the tiger reserves created under Project Tiger but does not have any tiger? Dampa Tiger Reserve in Mizoram, Kamlang in Arunachal, Kaval in Telangana, Satkosia in Odisha and Sahyadri Tiger Reserves in the region of Maharashtra. So keep these important facts for your mind. A very probable question can come from this because 50 years have also completed since the launch of Project Tiger, and we move forward to the next news, where we'll cover an important personality which has actually mentioned in the news today. Why? Because there is a specific book called as The Sage Who Reimagined the Hinduism, and that has been written by Shashi Tharoor. What Shashi Tharoor says? He writes about Sri Narayan Guru. He says that he was not a Savarna reformer, but an Avarn organic intellectual, where he maintained a focus on upward mobility through modern education and did not champion the Sanskritization to the extent of the other reformers, like for example Swami Vivekanand or for example Dayanand Saraswati of Arya Samaj. But his great significance for Tharoor lies on a more philosophical level. Reimagining Hinduism, Tharoor's core interest is actually in the Guru Ka Guru, that is his reinterpretation of the Vedantic thought to actually provide an intellectual foundation for the change on the ground, where Sri Narayan Guru actually wrote a book. The book is called as a kind of a poem which is based upon Advait, and that is Devadasakam, where he actually propounds further on the theory of Advait Vedanta which was given by Adi Shankaracharya. What does Advait Vedanta basically says? So, Shankaracharya says that, let's say for example I am a human being, a mortal, who is actually trying to search for the Brahman which is basically the God, the Brahman, right? That is basically the ultimate reality, the universal essence of all the existence. So he says that this Brahman is basically nirgun, right? It does not have specific attributes so that you cannot imagine it. Rather, as a human being, where you have an Atman, that is the individual soul and that is the essence of the self, you can actually experience this Brahman. Why? Because Atman and Brahman are one and the same, right? That is Advait Vedanta. So basically, let's say for example what Adi Shankaracharya is trying to emphasize upon is that in you itself there resides the God, right? Like for example, let's say I take up a candle and I end up lighting a lot of candles from it, and then I keep this candle in one among the candles and I ask you which of them contains the original flame, and that is the idea which is being propounded in Advait Vedanta by Adi Shankaracharya, on which Sri Narayan Guru is writing a book called as Devadasakam. So the moment I establish that yes, indeed, each and every individual's Atman consists a part of Brahman, it basically implies that in you also resides a God, and thus service to mankind is service to God itself, right? So basically you should actually focus upon the internal purification. Now we'll see that how this same theory of Advait Vedanta was actually utilized by Sri Narayan Guru when he will actually have a kind of a debate with Gandhi, and thus will save Hinduism in Kerala from itself by creating a version that was more inclusive and palatable to all. Because now you should actually do the service to all the people around you, thus making it more inclusive in the nature. So for example, he for the specific upliftment and the economic inequality which was being faced by the untouchable caste Ijavas and the caste discrimination which they were facing, where they were not even allowed to access the road which went to the temple. So for their upliftment, Sri Narayan Guru basically launched a movement called as Aravipuram movement. And inspired by Sri Narayan Guru to actually propagate his teaching, there came Padmanabhan Palpu, who launched a movement called as Sri Narayan Dharm Paripalan Yogam in the year of 1903. He wrote another book where he actually kind of equated the inclusiveness of Krishna, Buddha and Adi Shankaracharya, and that book is called as Anukampa Dasakam. So remember that in the year of 1925, there was actually a kind of a debate which takes place between Gandhi and Sri Narayan Guru in the backdrop of Vaikom Satyagraha 1924 for the entry of the lower caste people into the temple of Vaikom in the region of Travancore at that point of a time. So Gandhi ji, who was basically, who used to uphold the Varna system, he said that it is basically a kind of a very important socio-economic division of the society which was done by our ancestors. And thus he gives a kind of an analogy of a tree, that look at a tree, it has different branches, each branches has leaves of different size, and that is Varna system, right? But the tree is one and the tree is Hinduism. To which Sri Narayan Guru very characteristically replied at that point of a time that yes, indeed, but the water which is sustaining that tree as well as that leaf is one and the same, and that water is nothing but the God, Advait Vedanta. And thus he gave the call for one caste, one religion, one God for mankind. Similarly, for the upliftment of your Satnami sect, such effort was actually taken by Guru Ghasidas. And for the upliftment of Matua sect, such steps were taken by Haridas Thakur. Keep them in your mind and we move forward to the last news of the day, where we'll read about India's regional navigation system. Why? The last atomic clock aboard the Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System, that is IRNSS, has failed. The Indian Space Research Organization ISRO actually said that in a statement, which further weakens the country's indigenous global positioning system called as NavIC. Keep this in mind. What are first and foremost, what are these atomic clocks? So these atomic clocks, they actually provide a standard frequency rather than the time of the day. So to actually define the length of a second, the instrument is actually measured with exquisite precision the frequency of microwaves which is actually absorbed by this cesium-133 atoms, and that basically constitutes your atomic clocks, which are actually critical to satellites to offer positional, navigational as well as timing services. So 8 satellites were originally launched between 2013 and 2018. 7 were originally placed in the orbits. The Union government has actually encouraged various Indian enterprises, including manufacturers of computers and electronic goods having some timing services, to rely on the NavIC for determining the Indian Standard Time. However, with one more satellite which has now become dysfunctional, this NavIC system or GPS system, which was indigenous in the nature, is actually now going to not function up to its optimum. So the current reference standard for many of such industries and companies is actually US Global Positioning System. ISRO said that NavIC will provide from now onwards one-way broadcast messaging services. And this one satellite which has now become dysfunctional, it actually completed its design mission life. So ISRO basically said that how these satellites were actually placed more as a kind of a fallback system in a kind of a geopolitical tension events which are taking place. So what if, let's say, USA in the future says that no, we will not provide you GPS, how you will use your Ola? And thus it was more like a kind of a fallback system. So till now 5 out of 8 satellites have already become dysfunctional. And the atomic clocks which now became dysfunctional was actually not indigenously made, rather it was imported from Switzerland based company called as Spectra Time. Coming to a few facts about your Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System IRNSS, which was developed and operated by ISRO, an independent regional navigation system, which used to provide us information about positions, navigations and timing in our country, and it was also capable, and it is capable to actually provide information up to 1500 kilometers beyond our borders. Our positioning accuracy was approximately 10 to 20 meters. However, the GPS by USA has a positioning accuracy more accurate because they have 30 satellites, so 5 to 10 meters. It also used to provide standard positioning services for civilians as well as some restricted and specific uses for military and authority. So there are currently 7 satellites, right, which were placed in the orbit, 3 in the geostationary orbit and 4 in the geosynchronous orbit. So keep these facts in your mind, and with this we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation and thank you.